Hi, it's Dennis Daly. There are parts of the country that I like to go back to repeatedly. One is the Portland, Oregon area. That whole Columbia River Valley is fantastic. And on one of my weekly shows back in the 1980s, I visited Bonneville Dam. At the time, a very gregarious man from the Park Service, Jim Runkles, was the head of tourism there, if you will, and served as my guide. Jim, it's a beautiful facility here, and I've been told that Bonneville was the first major hydroelectric project up here. As we head down...
First completed. Right. Grand Coulee was started before we were, but Bonneville was finished first.
I know I've lived in the East Coast most of my life, and there is some hydro out there. I guess the Tennessee Valley Authority would be the best example of that. As the Northwest was growing in the late 20s and we came through the Depression in the 30s, I guess there was a realization that electrical power was certainly going to be needed. This area with the power of the Columbia River just seemed to be right for that. I mean, hydro seemed to be the sensible thing to do.
And it still is. It's the cleanest, cheapest power production that you can have. We're not burning any fossil fuels. We're not burning any nuclear fuels. We're simply taking the power of gravity as water is pulled downstream.
Actually, explain for the layman how you generate electricity, what this plant would have in common with, let's say, even a coal-burning plant, and how the process works.
The process is you have water flowing downstream. Water is backed up by a dam, then run through in some cases a penstock, but in this case, since the dam is right across the river, just run into the units itself. It spins, it runs across blades, which spins a turbine. The turbine is connected shaft-wise, we can go right down here, okay, to a large coil, just like a generator in a car, or an alternator in the car.
Now, this visitor center where we are looks rather new compared. Of course, we're at the second facility, right?
That's correct.
When the initial one was built by the WPA, which young people may not know was actually a group of government projects to create jobs during the Depression, and many of our major facilities, highway bridges, major bridges, were built by the WPA. That would have been in the 30s. How new is this visitor center? And there's a second powerhouse now, isn't there?
That's correct. Right now we're approaching the fish viewing building, which was part of this second powerhouse complex, finished in 1982. The original one was completed in 1937, dedicated by FDR at that time, and has been producing power ever since.
Well, now we're going into, and you mentioned it, the fish viewing building, without, pardon my using a pun here, baiting the question. Why are you concerned with looking at fish in a facility that ostensibly is to generate electricity?
We produce electricity, that's true, but we're also responsible for making sure that the fish, the anadromous fish, which migrate from freshwater out into the ocean where they spend their lives and then come back to spawn, we're responsible to make sure that they pass the facilities without any harm.
Well, now to our left here is a display called Yesterday's Fishery. Take us through, being as descriptive as you can because we don't have the benefit of cameras here, and tell us what this display is all about.
Well, Yesterday's Fishery talks about the many different ways in which Americans and early Native Americans as well have taken fish from the river. When Lewis and Clark came through this area in 1805 and 1806, they commented about the huge stacks of fish at Celilo Falls, which is about 40 miles upstream of here. The Native Americans lived along the stream, and their lifestyles and their customs are based on the life cycle of the migrating salmon. Some of the things you see here, the huge nets, they used to build platforms out over the rushing water because the salmon migrate upstream, and they know it's upstream because they can feel the water coming against them. So where they find the most resistance, they know the water's falling the fastest. That's where they go back up. So you'll find them, you'd find the native platforms over these torrents of water, and the salmon jumping up those falls to try to get upstream.
Well, you know, what we have over here looks like the world's largest butterfly net in a way. The handle of it must be 10 feet long, and you could probably catch a 10-year-old child in the net. It must have taken either a very strong, I guess it were the Chinoots were among the tribe here, a very strong person with that, or a couple just to manhandle that net.
Yes and no. Some of the fish, of course, would weigh out at 50 to 60 pounds, in which you'll still see some of those, as we refer to them, hogs today. The matter of fact, we're just beginning to see the fall run coming in now. That'll run through probably about the middle of September. The Native Americans would actually be out over the river, and they would pull these rascals up one at a time.
Wow.
It's amazing the leverage it can get.
Well, you know, the Columbia is so important. You mentioned Lewis and Clark. There's Clark College in the Portland, Vancouver area. Everything is Lewis and Clark. It must have been a tremendous discovery for the fledgling country, America, basically an East Coast country at one time, to really discover that all of this was out here and that the Columbia was a way to get to the West Coast.
It was a very large portion of opening the West. Of course, the core of discovery, which was Lewis and Clark, was commissioned by President Jefferson to go out and find a northwest passage to the West Coast. And when they came down the Columbia, they found what they thought was just that. Beyond that, when they went back with all of their journals, all of the botanical discoveries that they'd found on the reports of the West, it really opened the West.
Speaking of opening the West, this is a question I know that you'll probably answer with a great deal of pride. It would seem that this whole expansion that we saw in this century into the Northwest, into Oregon and Washington, would have been impossible had it not been for this system of hydroelectric power.
Hydroelectric power, which was, of course, our first dam was started here and finished in 1937, originally was to open the area for manufacturing. It coincided with the World War II, and the power that was produced here was extremely important in the building of the Victory ships down here in the Portland area, and of course the Boeing plant up in Seattle. Without the electricity produced at these dams, they probably would not have been able to meet the war effort.
Jim Runkles of the Bonneville, I guess there are locks here also. It's a navigable stream at this point, and dam. Here we are in an area of the country where there are great debates going on about conservation, the great debate over cutting timber and that type of thing. How much work do you have to do with environmental interests to make sure that you're not messing up the environment? I mean, it would seem that your emphasis here, at least in this area, really is more on the environment than it is on making electricity.
We do produce power, and that is an integral part of our lifestyle here in the country. But we're also very, very concerned about how we interact with the environment. The running of this power plant is contingent upon the regulations put upon us by the National Marine Fisheries because the salmon are a threatened and endangered species at this point.
Spent the first half of the program talking about environmental things and basically about fish. This is the last thing I expected to see here. We are looking out through windows at fish which look as if they're standing still, but basically if you can see the flow of the water, they're actually swimming against the tide. Why do we need what looks like an aquarium here?
A lot of people think it is an aquarium. It's an educational on our part to try to get them to understand that this is simply looking into a ladder. The ladder raises the fish from the tail race level to the upstream level, which is the forebay. It's approximately 60-foot lift. So what they're doing is each one of the steps, and if you go out, as we go out here, you'll see the steps in the ladder, is approximately 1 foot. And what that does is creates the constantly moving water, so the fish will know that's where they have to go upstream.
As you said, they have to sense that to get the direction to return upstream. Right. And if we were to stay here, is this narrow enough that all of the fish that migrate would eventually come past these windows?
Yes and no. all of them that are on the Washington side. We have two.
Okay.
There's one on the Oregon side as well. There are only 2 points, and there are 2 people who sit in that counter room and count every fish that goes by.
Is there a position in the federal government called fish counter? It's a GS something. You apply to be a fish counter?
There used to be. At this point, this is contracted out, and they are state employees, part of the Washington Department of Wildlife.
Okay. Jim, take us around in our remaining minutes and describe where we're going now.
Well, now we're going to go up and over into the powerhouse. The powerhouse on the Washington side right now is shut down because the river levels are so low. We don't have the major units running. However, we do have the fish units running. There's water that's going through the fishways, and that extra water is also being routed through the fish units.
Well, let me ask a question about levels. I know that last year there was that tremendous debate that occurred in the Midwest, and a lot of people were really angry at the Army Corps of Engineers. There's always I'm from a river town in Indiana, Vincennes, where some of them praise the flood wall and the others say, well, if they just left the river alone. How often do you hear people saying, you've done more harm than good? And let me give you an opportunity to rebut that. What do you say to people who say, well, this really shouldn't be here?
There are a lot of people who do say that. We recognize that wherever you have 2 people, you're going to have 2 opinions. The power that's produced here is used not only here in the Northwest, it's also sent to Los Angeles area, and through the nets, the interties can go as far as to perhaps even to your home. The dams, we know, do kill some fish. We know that they flood some lands. We also know that they prevent floods from downstream. Here in the Portland, Washington area, the Vanport flood of 1948 came over this dam. This dam was in place at that point, but there were no more dams upstream other than Grand Coulee. And the floodwaters that came down here, we couldn't hold back. This is not a flood control dam. This is a run-of-the-river hydropower dam.
How important is it for you to monitor the level? Because we mentioned before that the Columbia up to this point is a navigable waterway. I would assume that there's a tremendous investment in shipping in this area. Is that fairly critical for the barges and the rest of the river traffic?
The primary point of construction for this dam in 1935 was not just power production, but also navigation. It was built at this location because the river level naturally dropped 60 feet in 4 miles. Now that's considerable. It's called head. That head is needed to produce power. It also blocks navigation. Mm-hmm. The old stern wheelers of the late 1800s would sometimes run the rapids.
Oh, really?
Yes, but that was only very brave or very stupid pilots. Now, this lock that's over here is the first one on the river. There are 7 more. And you can take an ocean-going vessel now from the ocean to Lewiston, Idaho, through our navigation channels.
What has that done to commerce and industry upstream? I mean, I would think having access to the Pacific, particularly now when we're talking about exchange with the Pacific Rim and that being a growing export market, is invaluable.
Well, it is. We send, when you look at the Navlock logs, you'll see tons and tons of grain coming downstream that is produced on farms that are irrigated from the river out of the lakes that are created behind the dams, using power to run the pumps to get the water to them. That grain is then transported downstream and to other countries. It's a large portion of our economy. Going upstream are gasoline and other manufactured goods that would take one barge, would take 50-some railroad cars of material going up this corridor. And that translates to 150 semis.
Well, I know that there are many industries, for example, in the Midwest where I'm from, that were it not for the fact that the Ohio is navigable up to a point, could never exist in that Cincinnati, Evansville, St. Louis area, and then up into the Mississippi and Missouri. I guess it goes without saying, it's a rather naive comment, that shipping by water is the least expensive way to move things.
Most definitely.
Now, we are down here, and there's a sign that says Turbine Pit. My goodness, this is almost something out of a science fiction movie here.
Well, it's funny you should say that. They did a science fiction movie here using our visitor facility a number of years ago. I won't say the name of it.
Doesn't sound as if you're very proud of it.
Well, it wasn't bad. It was more of a comedy than was anything else.
I see. Okay.
But they did use this facility. What you're looking at right now is this is a turbine pit area, which when you look in there, you'll see the steel shaft, stainless steel shaft, 24 inches in diameter, spinning. Below us is the turbine, the blades that look like a giant propeller, spinning, turned by the water, connected to that shaft, which goes up into the generator, which is this large cylinder you see here, and it spins in a mass of coils where, if you were to compare, say, your alternator in your car, each wire would be 4 inches wide, 1 inch thick. And it spins there, producing the power, and then it goes through these, what we refer to buses, out to the transmission line, over to a substation, and into the grid.
Well, you know, in turning that turbine, it's just it's about the same thing as, for example, a person's window fan that might be turned off, but yet the incoming air is turning the blades. And anyone who's stood in deep water can realize what an enormous force water has. And I guess the more you dam it up on one side, the more hydro pressure that you're forming there.
Right. That's the head I was referring to earlier. You have to have that head to be able to turn the units.
Jim, let's walk a wee bit further here. And I don't want to get into the debate about atomic and nuclear and all that kind of stuff. Are there any more power plants, hydro, under construction in the country? Are we pretty well stabilized as far as this part of the industry is concerned?
To my knowledge, there are not, but I'm not fully knowledgeable on that. Here in this Northwest, there is a possibility of a second powerhouse at one of the other dams. But other than that, we're fairly well maxed out. There are certain areas that have been proposed in the past that have been set aside because of environmental reasons, which is fine. You know, if they want to keep the river free, for no problem.
One of the things that impresses me, and I know, of course, this is a visitor center, I don't know whether it would be the same way had you not had visitors, is how clean everything is. I mean, here you have these enormous machines. This turbine is bigger than a house for some people. I'm not saying you can eat off the floor, but you have it painted nicely in different colors. It must just fascinate, particularly grade school students coming through here.
We have lots and lots of school groups that come through. This facility is the most visited core facility in the United States.
From a personal standpoint, what's it like to work here? I mean, it's such a neat place. I know that the Army Corps of Engineers has been a very, very important part of developing the country. In Washington, D.C., where I live, there's that wonderful reservoir on the north side of D.C., and the pump house is used as your logo for the Army Corps. But to show young people through and answer their questions, how does it feel?
I enjoy it. I moved here 14 years ago to work with the Corps of Engineers. They've been very straightforward and accommodating with me. I think that they're an excellent organization to work for.
What's the most common question kids ask?
Sometimes they'll ask if the water on the downstream is a different color because they've taken the power out.
I heard someone at Hoover Dam looking at those huge electrical wires leaving, which obviously are carrying the electricity away, making the comment, it must take a tremendous amount of electricity to run this place.
That's a good one. I hadn't heard that.
Jim Runkles of the Army Corps of Engineers, the resource manager at the Bonneville Lock and Dam, I want to thank you for joining us.
You're certainly welcome.
Anytime you go to any public works project, from the rather smaller dams of the Tennessee Valley Authority to Hoover Dam, Bonneville Dam, and others, you'll have quite an experience. I'm Dennis Daly.